first of all, thank you for coming, and thank all of our panelists for joining us. And if I could just name in alphabetical order, we've got Nour, Kanawati, Maghan, Keita, Marwan, Kreidie, Hafeez, Malik isn't here yet, we hope to see him soon, Silvia, NagyZekmi, Romaine, Warrick, and Karolina, Wolnicki. And I would like to go in no particular order except at the beginning. I'm going to ask our two student panelists to start us off with their comments. And I think Nour is our first lucky contestant here, who's going to share with us a little bit. When we're done just going through their brief comments, then I would like to open it up first to students, right? And any student comments, questions that you have. And after we've exhausted that, to go to people who look as young as I do. And we'll go with that order if that's okay. So, and then once we're done with Nour and Karolina, then I'll just ask the panelists to go in the order that they see fit. So, Nour, thanks so much for starting us off.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to the panel. On December 17th, 2010, a Tunisian man lit himself on fire, and he lit the entire Middle East on fire. He was a 26-year-old college graduate named Mohammed Bouazizi, and he was stopped by officers in the middle of the street for having an unlicensed vegetable cart. He was selling these vegetables to provide for a family of 8, even though he has a college degree, but this was the only job he could find. A woman, female police officer, spat in his face and slapped him across the face and said to him he cannot have this cart. He was outraged. He tried to pay her off, it didn't work. He tried to go to officials, it didn't work. Within the hour, he spilled petroleum all over himself and lit himself on fire. This was the political movement that was needed so that the government could hear what these people need, what's wrong with the economy, what's wrong with the system and the society. He lit himself on fire and he started a revolution. The next day, Tunisians came out and they ranted and they said things like, this was not fair, this is not okay. Why does it take a man to light himself on fire for the government to hear us? They came out in the thousands. And eventually, they caused a revolution across the Middle East. They caused one in Egypt, in Yemen, in Jordan, and we don't know who's next. But these revolutions are needed. It's time to change these corrupt regimes that have been in power for over 30 years. And that's how I would begin this panel.
I'd like to add a personal account to this rather than starting out with points that you've probably all read in the news lately. But 3 years ago, my family and I traveled to Egypt through a Polish tour trip. And we arrived and met a very interesting tour guide that was there from Cairo named Mina. And Mina was very young, 30 years old, freshly out of the university at Cairo, studied tourism, very knowledgeable in history. And during this trip, other than visiting the beautiful temples through Edfu, Kamambo, and as any tourist would go on the cruise of the Nile, I started talking to Mina. Mina was very intelligent. He spoke English perfectly despite having never left the country. And I could tell a certain frustration. He told me that despite him being connected through the internet at times and having censored news, he could never have his voice spoken. He has grown up through Mubarak's regime. He has never seen a fair ruler come up, always seen rigged elections. He himself was personally frustrated too because he couldn't get married. He didn't have a very stable job. He couldn't get an apartment. And he found that his own education had gone nowhere. So towards the end of our trip, I remember him mentioning that, be happy with what you have, that you can go travel around the world and have all this political freedom. But one day you will remember that the people of Egypt one day will speak out, and one day we may have democracy like you have maybe over in Poland or in the United States. And when I actually opened up the New York Times on January 25th and saw that the Egyptians have started gathering in Tahrir Square, I could hear his comments again in my head and now know that this revolution is very unique, not only in that it's another protest, but it's, as one of the Google executives that actually came out yesterday, Ghanem, mentioned that this is a new revolution. It's Revolution 2.0. Gathered through young people that are frustrated through unemployment, who can't get jobs, money, can't get married, and only have the internet at their disposal.
Well, I guess I won't be very imaginative. Should we just start, Silvia, and then just kind of go down?
Okay. I would like to make just one very brief point because I think the dialogue will be far more interesting than us going on and on and on. I would like to think about what, and make you think about, what is the position of the United States in this revolution? You know, what has been, what could be, what should be the position of the United States? The U.S. is caught in a very interesting dilemma in the Middle East, not just now, it's nothing new. It has been going on where the moral values of the country and the national interests actually diverge. And this is when very, not very clear statements will come out. And these statements are being revised daily as the situation changes slightly, then the statements follow. I don't know if you've followed the statement, I mean the spokesman, Gibbs. He's very carefully measuring his words. He speaks even slower than normal because he wants to make sure that he doesn't say anything wrong. You know, he has to be very careful. So he's not saying what he thinks, he's saying what is to be said that day, which may change the next day. Unfortunately, Obama's position, given his precedence in Cairo, the big speech that he gave at the beginning of his presidency, there was a lot of expectations about his presidency that it will be very different from his predecessors. But now he's talking about an orderly transition, which means really, if we read between the lines, more of the same. Maybe in a different name, maybe this name will be Omar Suleiman, maybe it's going to be somebody else, but it's going to be pretty much staying the course, which is very interesting because we are supposed to be advocating democracy. And so we are doing that, but on the other hand, we want to also keep the same type of regime. I'm not saying that he wants to keep a dictatorship, no. But he wants to keep something, or he wishes something that he can control, or the U.S. Policy will be something that is foreseeable, it's something that there will be no wild cards and no surprises. So that's all that I have to say.
Okay, I'll just make a couple of brief points as well. I liked where Nour started with this. She said, you know, a man set himself on fire in Tunisia and he set the Arab world afire. And I think that that is a good way of looking at it. This is something that significant, as though the world has been set ablaze. And we've seen this, we've seen demands and protests spreading from one country to the next. But the point I'd like to make is that while the political similarities and the economic similarities are striking, I don't think we should expect the demonstrations or the demands or the reforms that are eventually made to be the same in every country. So a lot of the speculation is, what we see in Egypt, is that going to happen in Jordan and is it going to happen in Yemen? Well, the short answer is no. Jordan and Yemen have some similarities with Egypt, but the Jordanian protesters were making different demands, sort of on a different scale. There are some commonalities there, but they weren't demanding the total fall of the regime or the replacement of the monarchy. They were demanding policy reforms and better governance. And in fact, all of these are really good governance demands in all the protests that we see. But I don't think we should expect the same outcome everywhere, and that's important to note because there's a tendency, I think, to say that maybe the Jordanian protests have failed or the Yemeni protests have failed because they haven't gone as far or been as large as the Egyptian protests. But people there are making protests in different systems and they want different outcomes. So in the case of Jordan, rather than demanding the fall of the regime, people demanded a change in the prime minister, a change in economic policy, the redressing of serious corruption. If the king can make those changes, then he may satisfy a lot of his critics. That's not really an option in Egypt. Mubarak can make some cosmetic or policy changes, and he's not going to satisfy his critics. And in fact, the speech that was being made as we began today, probably, at least as much of it as we saw before we started, didn't seem to be going far enough to satisfy those critics. So it's really a different sort of political calculation and a different set of specific demands in every country, and I don't think we should lose sight of that.
Well, before I start, has anything changed? Okay,
He
so
hasn't quit.
my good friend Shahab Kanawati, Nour's father, should embarrass her a little more, but has, you know, the social media of the day is looking at Al Jazeera and listening to Hosni Mubarak's speech as we we talk. Okay, real quick, I just want to say two quick things about how Egypt, how the importance of Egypt, but also some potential maybe historical similarities. In 1952, we have the start of the present regime in Egypt with a military overthrow of King Farouk. Very interesting dynasty in Egypt that started with basically the result of other foreign adventurisms by Napoleon. You had Muhammad Ali come in, and his Albanian dynasty lasted until 1952, when this corrupt monarch was overthrown by a group of young Egyptian officers. And the two most important people, there were 11 of them all in all, the two most important people were Gamal Abdul Nasser, who became perhaps the most charismatic and most dynamic, most important Arab leader of the 20th century, and his number two, Anwar Sadat, who, as we know, picked Hosni Mubarak as his number two. And so we're seeing the continuation of this military overthrow of the government in 1952. But what I think is important is not to give you a history lesson, but what this meant to the Arab world, okay? Now it's a different era. It's the era of bipolarity. You have the United States and the Soviet Union trying to get the whole world to join up on their successive teams. You have the Arab world fighting through colonialism. So Nasser appears, and it took him 2 years to become president after 1952, but he becomes the Arab leader and becomes the most charismatic, most beloved person in the Arab world, in spite of probably not doing that much. His economic reforms in Egypt, the agrarian reforms perhaps were successful. His industrial reforms were a disaster. But he brought back the pride of Egypt for a long period of time. But he also caused tremendous amount of mischief by foreigners, foreign countries in Egypt and the whole Arab world. Look, 52, they have the coup. In 1954, he becomes the leader. In 1956, you already have the first colonial invasions or post-colonial invasions of Egypt, with France and Britain invading Egypt with Israel in order to secure the Suez Canal, which Nasser nationalized. Nationalization was a big deal in the post-colonial era, nationalized in order to finance the Aswan Dam because the United States wouldn't help finance it. In 1958, and he actually, very interesting, he lost all the battles but won that war. The United States forced Israel, France, and Britain to leave Egypt, and Nasser got a great victory. The second big thing, 1958, he started unification movements. He was a pan-Arabist, and he started unification movements with Syria, okay? And that brought about another round of foreign intervention. In 1958, what happened? The Eisenhower Doctrine became a United States policy. The United States, because of Nasser, landed troops in Lebanon to protect its pro-Western government from Nasserite forces. The United Kingdom landed or airlifted troops to Jordan to protect the king against Nasserite forces. And Nasserite forces succeeded partly, but they succeeded in overthrowing King Faisal of Iraq. So this movement coming out of Egypt, and I think this is what we have to look at. What does Egypt mean to the Arab world? At least in the late 50s, the movement coming out of Egypt spread like wildfire. And I'm going to just say one other thing, and I was talking to Lowell about it. Nasser, the great revolutionary of Egypt, used the most important or the most new media of the social media of the day to rally the whole Arab world. It's kind of interesting. We see the new media of the day then, and we see the new media of the day now, Twitter and Facebook. In 1958 and in the 50s, he used radio. I mean, illiterate population throughout the Arab world. How do you get your voice across? Well, he was a great orator. The Egyptian government and its agents throughout the Arab world would give out little cheap transistor radios to everybody. So he was able to use that media to project his message throughout the Arab world using, again, the most new, the most dynamic media of its time, and was very successful in branding himself and branding the Egyptian revolution. Radio Cairo is and has always been, and to this day, a very important media outlet. The question is, where do we go? Is Cairo as important a media, cultural, political center of the Arab world, as important now as it was in the late 50s? No, it isn't. There are other areas that have taken over. But Cairo still is very important in the Arab world. So this revolution, while not, if it succeeds, and we don't know if it's going to succeed, will have reverberations. What they are, I agree with Catherine. They're all going to be different, but there's going to be a revolution.
Well, I was glued to Al Jazeera all day, so I don't have any prepared remarks, but I'm going to start by jumping off from something that Marwan just said concerning Nasser, which is another point that I think we need to remember, is that in certain respects, Nasser, for all of his charisma, which Mubarak certainly lacks, he was in some ways Mubarak's model for how to run a police state. And from there, I'm going to jump to what I was going to make my opening remarks. Yeah, I did prepare something, sort of, which is done with begging the pardon of the audience and my colleagues. I'm not going to address this as an academic, but as someone who, this is a perspective I know I share with at least one other person at the table. I've been married for 14 years to someone who grew up in a police state. So whenever there is something, a ripple like this or a major conflagration like what we're seeing now in the Arab world, it resonates particularly in my household. My husband feels this very viscerally, and he has a perspective to offer me that I don't understand from this in the same visceral way, because I have not lived the way he lived for the first 27 years of his life, which was in some sense always in fear. And there was an article recently posted by Robert Fisk, I believe he's a Beirut-based journalist, who talked about, among other things, the midnight knock at the door, and I know that I'm assuming that pretty much everybody here knows what he's referring to. It's when the secret police come knocking at your door, and there's a pretty good chance that if they get in, and they will, your family will never see you again or hear from you, or if they do, you may come back unrecognizable. My husband told me that if the door is a ground floor door and you don't open up, they'll bring a tow truck and put a hook in it and they'll wrench your door off. So they'll get you one way or another. And those of us who've grown up the way I did in this country, we've seen some erosion of our rights and our freedoms in the last, particularly during the Bush era, but we still don't know. We don't have, I don't think, the first idea really, unless we've experienced it directly, what it's like for people to live under an oppressive system like that. And certainly the man who lit himself on fire was, he illustrated it in a way that is almost beyond imagining. So that really is what I wanted to say, was to offer that perspective on it. And I think from there we have Maghan, are you speaking?
Well, I'm a historian, so I have a lot to say. By the way, Mubarak is not Stanford down. I just saw it.
Yeah, well, bad translation where I was. So. Let me begin in this way, with a kind of broader issue. Historically speaking, most of you young people who are in the audience are in an era that we continually refer to as the post. It begins with the anti. The anti is more than likely the anti-colonial movement, and that's where you need to consider yourselves in terms of being part of what is happening right now around the world. My meaning is that these are movements that are sparked by young people. When Gamal Abdul Nasser was coming to power, he was one of the young people who took over that country. If you think about what has happened in the world over the past 5, 10 years, even in less time than that, there have been movements of young people using the tools at their disposal in order to speak to injustice. So the point that I want to make here is that no matter the direction of this particular set of events that we look at in the Middle East, that we might look at happening in Iran or Myanmar or in Togo or possibly in Haiti, these things are things that are precipitated by young people, and they are game changers. This is a game changer. I was glancing at an online publication that I would suggest everybody get a hold of called The Globalist. And yesterday in The Globalist, Jean-Pierre Lemon noted one thing that I think most of us would kind of have some resonance with, but have always quoted it improperly. You all know Charles Darwin, right? Survival of the fittest. Well, that wasn't exactly Darwin's quote there. Darwin said, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the most responsive to change." So here, at this particular moment, there are at least 3 points of reference that we need to make in terms of thinking about change. One is the notion that what is going on in the Middle East right now, in all of these spaces, not just in Egypt, not just in Tunis, not in Yemen, but beginning in places like Iran, thinking about Iraq, are in fact game changers, and they affect the political economy. They affect the notion of access to resources. And one of the things that we're going to have to ask about, in particular, space like Egypt, but in places like Tunis, in which some of the issues are the same. Yes, it questions, like Catherine said, about questions of responsible and responsive governance. It's also a question about access to resources. And when we think about those access to resources, one of the things we're going to have to think about is the call for a greater democratization of resources. And in the world in which we live, in a world in which 5% of the population, the world's population, consumes 20% of the world's resources, we're going to have to ask ourselves, what are we going to be willing to do without as Americans if we believe in the process of democratization? You have choices to make as young people. You have changes to make. You have to be, as Darwin said, adaptable if you wish to see your way of life or some semblance thereof survive. So, U.S. consumers, you need to think of higher prices. You need to think of maybe lower corporate bonuses or dividends. You can't have both. There may be a moment when we also need to rethink some key elements of the political economic structure. Are we going to even some things out? Or are we going to go the path of thinking that we can continue to consume what we consume and not have any repercussions? The prime example here, of course, is energy. That's going to play out there. There's also going to be a question of foreign policy. Already, even though Europeans are talking about banning burqas and not having minarets raised, etc. and so on, Europeans are beginning to think their relationship to the Arab and Muslim world. In fact, one of the arguments that is being made is that as China becomes a greater and greater economic power, the Middle East, so to speak, has more in common with Europe and America than it does with the, quote, Far East, end quote. What's going to be the realignment there? How is this going to be rethought? What are going to be the sets of players? Israel, in relationship to foreign policy, is in the midst, right now at this moment, rethinking its position. If you've been following any of the news over the past week, the leak of the Omar Abbas discussions through WikiLeaks are in fact almost like pouring gas on this particular situation in Israel. Omar is arguing, I had a deal. Abbas is saying, we had a deal. And everyone is saying to the other parties, the American government, and to the current Israeli government, so where were you as deal makers? And here, in the great space of democracy where everything is up for grabs, the Israelis are feeling the pinch in terms of not understanding and not knowing that they do not have a, quote, reliable autocratic partner on one side of the equation. So this is a game changer. And then as I listened to Shibli Tahami as I was walking out of the office on my way over here, Shifty Tahami said that there's another set of actors who are thrown into disarray in terms of foreign policy action. Under the broader rubric of Al-Qaeda, all those who are seeking, in fact, a radical Islamic state in any of these places are thrown into disarray in terms of rethinking their strategies, because the people who are in fact attempting to take power now are the people who are working in diametric opposition to what they want. So here, within the framework of foreign policy, game changers. The big game changer, though, which may never happen if Silvia's remarks are right on the money, is that the people who really need to rethink their foreign policy are the people in the United States. This is the supreme moment for American foreign policy analysts to rethink their position and to move America, to use the Sarah Palin analogy, out of the crosshairs of everyone else in the world who dislikes America. This could be your moment, those of you who are being trained at a place like Villanova, in terms of influencing, reshaping, redirecting, advising those foreign policy concerns. That's where we are right now. The final thing that I need to say in thinking about the former two is this. Americans are poor students of the thing that they cherish most, democracy. We fail to understand it in theory, and we fail to recognize it in practice. People keep saying, oh, the Egyptians aren't ready for democracy. I would recall that in 1776, somebody was saying that about the Americans. And we seem to have made some go of it. I won't say it was a good go, but some go of it, all right? The process that needs refinement. Always. We're poor at recognizing the fact that there is no democracy singular, but there are democracies plural. People work themselves through this process. The thing that is most important, though, is that in our myopia about what democracy means theoretically and then in practice, we think that the only democracy that should be, and this is back to Silvia's observation, is a democracy, in quotation marks, that meets our needs. So if people elect leaders that we don't like, we think, in fact, that they are in opposition not simply to our policy, but also to the very notion of democracy. We need to grow up, we need to mature, we need to become sound critical thinkers and analysts, and we need to understand that if we're going to be champions of democracy, that we have to, one, understand democracy, and then begin to recognize it in its many forms. So those are 3 points. The game changes. Changes in the questions of political economy, changes in the questions of foreign policy, whether we like it or not, and the need to change our notion of the things that we hold most dear and that we think of as the ethical anchors of being American.
I'd like to thank, first of all of our panelists for getting us started off, and thank you to Nour and Karolina for really beginning the panel. And if I could ask for students to start off our discussion, and it's always the most courageous thing to ask the first question. So I will come and give you a microphone because it's always difficult for everyone else to hear your question if I could. So or comments if you would like.
Yes, don't.
My question was for anyone. I want to know how legitimate are U.S. politicians' concerns? We're hearing a lot of talk about the Muslim Brotherhood being described in this resolution much the same way the Ayatollahs or the Iranian revolution is told. It's hard to gain insight without personal connections to the area. Some people are saying that this is just fear-mongering on behalf of politicians who want Western support to get power, or is there something else?
I got to jump right into this one. I think maybe for some people it's fear-mongering, but it's also a genuine misunderstanding on some parts, but we've seen this in commentary for quite a while now, that the threat is that radical Islamists will come to power, and the Muslim Brotherhood are those radical Islamists. And that's wrong in two ways. The Muslim Brotherhood are a lot more religious conservatives than they are any entity like Al-Qaeda, for example. So those are not the same sort of thing at all. And there's also a misunderstanding about how powerful they are in Egyptian society. So their amount of support in society generally is widely estimated to be between 20 and 30%. So they don't have sort of majority support. They're not likely to be the dominant party in whatever emerges from the current protests, certainly not a takeover, and they're not the sort of radical player that they're often depicted as being, especially these days. On the other hand, they're one of the best organized opposition groups in Egypt. So sort of in institutional organizational terms, they have some clout and they can get some things done. So they're very likely to be a player, but very unlikely to be the ones determining the nature of the new regime in a way that you often see in the commentary that you're talking about.
Yes, add something. I would like to add to this that the differences between the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an organization that is peaceful, and they are conservative, religious conservative, but they are peaceful, and Al-Qaeda is it has totally different views of what needs to be done and how it wants to reach its goals. So much so that Zawahiri, who is one of the leaders of Al-Qaeda, wrote a book criticizing the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt for its lack of initiative and lack of aggression. That's one point. The other thing is that this, what you call fear-mongering, rightfully so, or whatever, I don't know, it depends on everyone's concept of it. It is precisely the Mubarak regime that was proposing these ideas that, okay, look people, it's either me or them. So if you are mobilizing against me, you will have them. You will have an Iranian-style government. But the circumstances in Iran during the revolution there and Egypt today is very different. Have you seen, for example, among the people who, you probably saw the pictures on television, have you seen green big signs that, or Qurans being waved or any of those things? We have not. We have seen signs for Mubarak to leave, to have democracy, to open the prisons, to have another constitution. But in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood in the first week of the protest wasn't even participating because they were afraid that it's going to fail and they didn't want to go to jail. So they came on board later. So this whole very spontaneous protest, as you said, came up because of the youth, because of the April 6th movement, because there were a number of these sort of unorganized movements that sparked up by this Tunisian who set himself in fire. And in fact, in Egypt, there were several people who did that. And in Algeria, 4 people set themselves in fire in protest of their government, so far that I know.
I agree with that. I mean, the reason we heard about the Muslim Brotherhood is because Mubarak is trying to send that message to the U.S. I mean, when he made the interview with ABC, he said he doesn't want to step down so chaos doesn't ensue. Because millions of people protesting every day is not chaotic at all. This going on for 17 days, I personally believe is super calm. I mean, he's trying to show that if he steps down, the Muslim Brotherhood is going to come in. And just like you said, they have no plans of coming in. They didn't even want to participate. They didn't want to be part of it or part of the government. The leaders of Muslim Brotherhood told their followers, if you want to jump in, don't jump in as a Muslim Brotherhood member, jump in as a civilian. Go in against the government to get your rights, not as someone part of this group. So I really don't believe that the U.S. should be fearing them or fearing that they take power.
And you have this whole thing is who lost Egypt? You hear that fear-mongering? Some pundits are comparing this to Iran. You can't compare the two. Iran had a leader in exile, a very charismatic leader who used another form of media, the cassette tapes, to great success. His speeches were everywhere. And Shiite Islam is very different than Sunni Islam in that Shiite Islam, which is in Iran and has not been in Egypt since the Fatimids, were destroyed by Saladin in 2,000 years ago. Sunni Islam is horizontal, while Shiite Islam is a very vertical and has hierarchies and much better organized. So, two different worlds.
Two points I wanted to make. Part of it, the question of the fear mongering. This is what students who study at Villanova need to do in relationship to being critical thinkers. No one is talking about the United States or France or Britain as Christian spaces. So what is our concern if, in fact, you have a space that democratically elects people who happen to be Muslims? Again, we need to understand where we are in the world. That's not ours to dictate. The other thing is a longer historical view of the Iranian crisis as a lens on what we should not be doing in Egypt, and that's part of the fear. There are some people, in fact, in the administration who do study history. The reason that the Ayatollah could come back into power is because the United States put into place, after a democratically elected prime minister, a military dictator known as the Shah of Iran, after a democratic election. So we need to be very careful about these things. And the thing that's going to be that is really interesting is that we have all of these people who are, in fact, quote, specialists on the regions. I've worked in the State Department, I've done policy analysis, I've been there, I've been here, I've done this, I've done that. We're coming out and saying, oh, well, democracy is very unstable. Tell us something new. And therefore, the Americans have a dilemma. And it's a dilemma that Silvia pointed out. Are we going to, in fact, deal with our ethical, historical moorings, or are we going to, in fact, get caught up in the notion that we must have everything and have it our way? And that's going to put us in a very dangerous situation, or keep us in a dangerous situation. But there's history here that becomes very important in terms of understanding it.
My understanding is in the Middle East, a lot of countries, governments are the large part of the time. Maybe it's jobs and those times the government jobs. So in the context of Egypt and perhaps the other countries experiencing the revolution, to what extent can the rank and file employees of these governments are there sort of stability, moderation as transitions unravel and unfold in the next 1 to 2 years, the next year?
Maybe, if that's a definitive enough answer. It depends, I think, which organs of the government we're talking about, because the civil service, professionalized bureaucracy, that can be important in a transition. But one of the big employers, just before I walked over here, Anderson Cooper was saying, and I don't know if Anderson's right or not, but he was saying that the Egyptian Mukhabarat employ 1 million people. In a country of 80 million, 1 million people work for that agency. It's hard to believe, but it's a very large number. For the Interior Ministry as a whole. If some ministries are disbanded, or from the example of Iraq, if we disband something like the military, there are institutions that you can disband that would then create huge problems. So I think it sort of matters which organ of government we're talking about, because one of the demands in Egypt is that the Interior Ministry be dismantled, which then puts out onto the street people who are probably slightly more pro-Mubarak than the average population.
And the military itself is, I think one of the things that we're seeing is that the military is going to be critical in whatever happens, but the military itself is much, when we think of the military here, I mean, the military here is a big part of the economy, but the military in Egypt does more than just run the military. They run factories, they have development companies, they run resorts. I mean, they're much more than strictly an armed force. So they are themselves a big part of the economy.
Yeah, this was a very interesting phenomenon that was I am not sure when it happened in Egypt, but in several countries, it used to be like the big landowners who were running the country economically versus the military who was doing everybody's dirty work. And from like at least the 60s or 70s on, these two powers merged, and the military themselves became economic powers. And so it's not going to be either or, it is going to be the one power that holds both the economic power and also the power of enforcing the rules.
Thank you for very interesting comments. I just had one question, and that is, it says in any democracy, who's next? Who do you personally feel might be the next state or group to be ready to take up the banner of change? Would it be the Palestinians? Would it be another group? Have you really looked at who you personally feel would be the next group to show us that change is really coming?
I think Algeria might be one of those countries. There is a huge demonstration planned for the 12th, day after tomorrow. And the president, Bouteflika, already said that the demonstrations can go ahead everywhere except in Algiers. Now, Algeria is a very centralized country, and I really would like to bet my last quarter on the fact that the demonstrations will go on in Algiers. I am a little bit worried about how much violence there will be. Now, there is one thing that the Algerians are really incensed at what happened in Tunisia. However, they do have an elected government, but they have a very corrupt and inefficient government. There is an economic situation with the food prices going up. There were already different demonstrations, and the president is inefficient, he didn't do anything. So, and there won't be elections because the military is holding everything up. So that is a problem. On the other hand, there may not be a revolution in Algeria because there has been a civil war from 92 to 2002 roughly, and they are war weary, they are terror weary. There were, I don't know what the estimates are, but 200, 300,000 people died in that civil war. That was barely reported, of course. And so they might not go for it this time because they say we just want to live in whichever way. So I don't know if you agree with me, but it can go either way, I think.
Well, I think it might be good to make a footnote that the reason for the civil war, essentially, and you can correct me if I get the subtleties of this wrong, but there was an election that was held, and a relatively moderate Islamic.
No, it was not moderate. There were several wings. Some of them were more moderate.
Well, there was they were, in any case, they were elected.
Yes,
they were democratically elected, and the military proceeded to nullify the elections. Yes. And you can't do that. If they were voted in, they were voted in. If that's a democracy, you can't say, okay, some of us don't like some parties, and I won't name any names in this country, but we can't tell them not to stand for election, at least as things are right now. And you can't do that anywhere else either. If you're going to have what you consider any stripe of democracy, yes, there are different kinds of democracies, but if you're going to have a real democracy, then you can't just nullify the results because you don't like them. And that's what happened, and the result was a bloodbath that went on for about a decade. So that's kind of coming back also to the comment about the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, I think, are very different from what we had in Algeria. But if they were voted in, if they happened to be voted in, if this revolution succeeds in its objectives, they will be voted in by a true democratic process. They will be subject to checks and balances, and if the people don't like them, they'll vote them out again. That's at least, in the ideal world, and I know it doesn't necessarily work that way, but that's the notion. So
I think it all depends on what happens. I mean, if Mubarak does get overthrown, I think you'll see the movement go faster. It was an interesting article that I forgot where I read it. I'm going through all these different things, and they're all blurring, but it was that the Saudis were saying that if the United States cut off aid to Egypt, they were going to pick it up. The Saudis are worried. Okay, And I think what's happening with Mubarak, and this is just, I don't have any kind of direct line into that, but I am convinced that the other Arab dictators are saying this is our last stand. If Mubarak falls, I mean, who's next? I think that's what has to happen, personally. But I just went through this real quick. Palestinians, they called elections. You know, Jordanians, it's a weird dynamic. 70% of the country is Palestinian, and the Jordanian army is made up of royal troops. Sudan, it could happen. Syria, they'll shoot everybody, it will not happen. Right? It's not going to happen in Syria. Yemen, perhaps, and Saudi Arabia is interesting. Lebanon's a different story. They've had their elections, and they have elections. It's a different world. And Algeria, as we said. So, I don't know about Morocco.
I think that one of the flaws in terms of the analysis that's going on, though, is the attention that's paid to Mubarak. Mm-hmm. If Mubarak were to step down in the next moment, the issue is that Mubarak represents a class, and that class is not yet willing to give up power because they are sitting in the streets in tanks. Yeah. And so it's going to be, the next stage is going to be, and this goes on throughout the region, is going to be the question of the ability of those people who are in Tahrir Square and people like them to negotiate with the military. Mm-hmm. And so the next stage is going to be serious negotiation with the military. That the description that Silvia gave is in fact, it's a feudal power. Mm-hmm. We're back to a sense of modern feudalism, and the military, men with guns are in fact very important here, and that's what we need to recognize.
Also, to a certain extent, it matters how much the U.S. wants a democracy to happen somewhere. Mm-hmm. Palestine's your perfect example. They voted in Hamas, and the U.S. was like, no, no, we're not going to work with you. That's not okay. So if the U.S. is not okay, like that was democratically elected. They had their democracy set up, and the U.S. doesn't want to work with it. So to a certain extent, we play a big role in whether a democracy is going to be set up anywhere in the Middle East.
And I just wanted to say something about Maghan's point about the military. Clearly going to be an important power deciding what happens next in Egypt. But in addition to the other dictators watching what happens to Mubarak, I suspect that the other militaries in the region are watching what the Egyptian military does, because they've behaved in a somewhat unpredicted way in this conflict, in that they have not engaged. The assumption going in was that they are the regime's military and they would be the enforcers, and they have not reliably enforced what the regime wanted them to do in the current demonstrations, which is not to say they're a pro-democratic force that's going to be distributing flowers, but they've actually refused some orders to engage with the protesters and set themselves up in a position where the chants in Tahrir Square were the people, the military, we are one, earlier today.
The wild card here is the difference between the military and the police force. Yeah. So we Americans don't seem to recognize this kind of thing, but the issue of where police power lies in relationship to where military power lies is a fundamental issue here, and it's a contention that's going to go on in most of these countries.
I have a question for the entire panel. If there is to be a regime change in Egypt, what do you think will happen between the relations in Israel and Egypt in terms of the current alliance and peace treaty?
Well, I think it depends on who takes power. So now, if they transfer power to the Vice President, Omar Suleiman, I don't know how much changes there will be between Egypt and Israel. I feel like that's something they'd be rooting for him to take power. But if someone else took power, you don't know who yet, and we don't know how that's going to come down. First off, you need Mubarak to step down. Then talk about someone else taking power. It depends on their point of view to see if changes will happen. But since the U.S. provides so much aid to Egypt, and the U.S. wants them to be friends with Israel, I think that's going to play a really big role in whether any change can happen.
Let me throw something interesting out. I don't know if people followed the World Cup. I did, but Egypt almost made it into the World Cup, and they lost to Algeria. And it was such a contentious game that it was the best out. They had to do the best out of 3, and they were supposed to be held in Egypt, but it was so tense that the game was actually held in Sudan.
They beat up the players.
And they beat out, it was horrible. Egypt recalled its ambassador from Algeria because of that. Now, 2 years before, or 3 years before, when the Israelis attacked Gaza, there was a lot of agitation in the streets of Egypt. Egypt did not remove its ambassador from Tel Aviv, and a lot of people were saying, wait a second, you're removing the ambassador because of a soccer game and not because of the Palestinians.
Well, come on,
Look,
Gaza, football.
well, football. So, my feeling is the treaty will stay, but it's going to be a different dynamic. Because if you look at any polling data, the plight of the Palestinians is within the top 3 to 5 main issues of the Egyptian, of any Arab country. But in Egypt, it's up there. I think I don't have it in front of me, but it's in the top 5 issues. They sympathize and they want a better outcome from the Palestinians, from the people. So that's my 2 cents. I still think the treaty is going to be there, but there's going to be much more pressure to change the situation. They will probably not enforce the embargo of Gaza.
That's the pressure that the Israelis are feeling right now.
Mm-hmm.
The Israelis, even though Netanyahu's government is saying, oh, what's going on the Arab street means nothing to Israel. They are busy trying to find a way to resurrect this plan that was brokered by Omar and Abbas. And that was, in fact, within a hair's breadth of being signed. So one side of the equation, the analytical equation says that if, in fact, Egypt and the rest of the Middle East roll this way, and it's all this, quote, chaos, democratic chaos, then all bets are off in terms of Israel and a Palestinian solution. The other side of the equation is saying, Israel, if you want to cover your butt, then you had better come to terms with something before everything else happens. So there's a great deal of tension that's going on here, and behind the scenes, a great deal of effort and pressure being put in terms of trying to, in fact, have something else happen in the Middle East that will give you a concrete peace. Now, here's the domestic thing that's interesting. If you're watching Fox versus CNN, or is it Fox versus MSNBC, whoever
MSNBC.
Fox versus the world, okay? If you're watching Fox, okay, the critical thing that is on the minds of Fox pundits is that if, in fact, there should be a resolution in Egypt that tends to be cosmetically favorable to the notion of democracy, then this is another weight on the side of the Obama administration as they move towards 2012. Now, measure this. If this weight, Egypt, and the rest of the Middle East pushes Israel into a position where it must, in fact, pursue some kind of legitimate peace and the recognition of a Palestinian state, what does that say about American domestic politics in 2012? There are a lot of people who are betting against this right here in this country. And so you can see them trot out on Sundays and probably, I guess every day, because that stuff goes on continuously, doesn't it? So, yes, those are some of the issues that are going on there.
And also, this morning, I was reading a CNN article. I was talking just about this point exactly, and they said a statement in there that resonated with me, so I wrote it down, and it said, and concerning the Americans, the lesson is clear. Even when they embrace secular democracy, Arabs may be allowed liberation only if it comes on top of American tanks or when it suits Israel. And that, like I said, that resonated with me so much because to a certain extent it's true. They're not going to let someone go into power if they're not going to uphold this treaty with Israel. And so nothing's going to change, really.
I want to start from that. This morning, the speaker of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt said, we will honor all the treaties the British government got. But at the same time,
What happened in East Gaza, that's what caused Mubarak that level today. His position was closing Gaza and stop all the humanitarian aid to Gaza, the people, the needy. That's what caused that plan, and that's what the people are. Definitely going to be changed. Definitely going to be changing, but not on the treaty like you say. But a lot of things going to be changed. You have to open Gaza. Before any peace treaty, a good peace treaty happened within Israel and the Arab countries, a lot of that movement will happen. But we've seen stability in Tunisia for two reasons. The first reason is the president right now is doing a lot of improvements in the country. One. Secondly, his national standing out with the Hamas, with the People Sea, with Lebanon, with Iraq, that will help them as on the streets of the Arab world. The last CNN poll what happened last year, they polled about 20,000 people from the Arab world. Bashar Assad, which is the Syrian president, became number one. Hafeez became number two in the Arab world. Mubarak has no level on that. That means the Arab streets, the way they take it, their nationality it became first. That's before even the economy, before even the hunger. Go back to the Algeria, which I think is number two in the movement. Because in 1992, when the Muslim Party became elected, all the West, not the military, all the West was against it. And like you say, they could be voted out after 40 years or 5 years or whatever. It didn't do right. The mistake this country doing in the Middle East policy is ignoring the Muslim view and the Muslim party and the Muslim, mostly Muslim brotherhood, totally all the Muslim party. Because like you said exactly, those countries are Muslim. Those countries are Muslim. And if we see the Muslim Brotherhood are 20% of the nationality there, actually another 40 or 60% are related to that. They have their view, they have their thinking. That's why we have to stand out and talk to the Muslim Brotherhood, get them to the table, get everybody on the table, and we will get a big peace in the Middle East. And that's so important. That's why Algeria should be the next, and the Muslim party will be back. I think after that, Abbas have a lot of trouble. Absolutely, after the beast, what happened with the latest information coming from the media, Abbas has a lot of trouble. When we're talking about Jordan, 40% of the Jordanian people are tribes. The tribes are backing up the money, but yesterday, they closed the red line. They sent a warning to the king, your wife has to stop giving, economic exactly to her family, like exactly what happened in Egypt. What happened exactly with the wife of President Tunis, with his wife. His wife and his family was controlling the economy. Now the Queen of Jordan stopped doing the same thing, and this is the first time in about 40 or 50 years the tribes stopped talking and talking loudly. Those things have to be stopped. Yesterday they are talking about changing the government, and they're not happy with the new government that is happening. They want it to be changed, but next is going to be a red flag to the king, and that's going to be a major issue.
I have one very direct question, and that is, what should I read after I read on my iPhone the headlines coming from the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Los Angeles Times?
Juan Cole's blog.
Okay, go to Juan.
Juan Cole, JuanCole.com.
Wonderful.
He is an he was probably one of the best Middle East commentators, and I read his blog every morning, so.
Juan Cole. Juan
Juan
Cole.
Cole.
And then I have a question.
Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera English.
Al Jazeera and Noam Chomsky on Democracy Now! Recently had some excellent
Democracy Now!
insights.
Also.
Democracy Now!
Yes,
is,
yes,
yeah.
I do want that.
Yeah, because Sharif Abdul, who is their one of their major producers, he's in Tahrir Square he has been there for like 10 days. Juan Ko was our keynote speaker in the conference last year.
The Guardian newspaper in London is extremely good.
And BBC.
Then that simple question leads to the more complex question. And the more complex question has implications, ramifications for all of us as we move forward, because the world is going to continue its transformations, and in those areas where the world is changing more rapidly, it is the college students and the young professionals that have in fact taken the lead. The last time we saw that in the United States was, you know when. And we haven't seen it since in the same kind of way, so the Green Peace movement and the ecology movements are filled with the young. So my question to Dr. Keita, because I know I can pick on him and then others will protect him.
That last clause doesn't count.
Can we redact that from the transcript? My question is, with the game changers that we have seen and will continue to see, and with the recommendations, with the imperatives that you have given our Villanova students to be aware, what kind of sea change might we advocate as lifers at Villanova University? A lifer is one who is on the faculty professional staff and plans to be here until we are no longer able. But what shall we advocate? And how shall we listen to the voices of the students on our very own campus, within the classrooms, seminar rooms, and beyond, to ensure that the game changers out there have at least the resonance of a sea change, if not a sea backwater, on our very own campus, so that we don't have to come and ask, where shall I read next? When I read in the New York Times, the military has determined that it will, and thereby they are moving Mubarak further and further away from decision making. That could be true, and if so, we're closer than we thought, but it could not be. So I'm worried about where we go as members of a community in an institution that is obliged to communicate and educate and become educated ourselves.
Is that for me?
The end.
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Yeah, to start. I mean,
How many of you know that that there's some discussion on Division 1A here? Raise your hands high. I can't see. Yeah. So here's the fundamental question about that you're making about Villanova and the charge of lifers to those who are simply peripatetic, who just move through here every 4 years. What is more important, an investment in your education or an investment in the athletic program? That becomes a fundamental issue. Almost everybody on this panel who is faculty have walked into a classroom and have said to you, any of you and all of you and your peers, that you need to become serious, deliberate, and conscious critical thinkers. That's not just, as you say, backwash. I mean, it's not something that's a throwaway. It's a serious issue. In that serious, deliberate, and conscious critical thinking, the fundamental issue for you is what kind of connections can you make? Have you made a connection between being Division 1A and what that means in terms of the economic or the intellectual integrity of the place that you call Villanova? I don't think very many of you in the audience came here to play football. But there's a connection. The connection becomes globalized. We live in an interconnected world. It's only if you are capable of thinking critically about those connections that you'll be able to make some impact in whatever way you want to make that impact. Maybe some of you think that Division 1A is a great thing. Make the impact that way. Think critically about it. Some of you think that democracy around the world and at home is a wonderful idea. To make that connection. But we can't have the connection if we don't, in fact, think about investing in all ways that you can interpret that term in the intellectual capital of the university. And that's the students and the people who teach them. So it's about critical thinking. It's about making connections.
How many students here have taken a semester abroad? I think everyone has to do that. I mean, I think if you really want to see the world and understand, well, you should take it. If you can do it, do it. And go, I mean, go to London, that's fine, but go to Egypt, go to Syria, go to Lebanon, go to Jordan, go to Ghana. Experience something completely different.